Hey, what's going on? DelVecchio here from websiteprofitcourse.com, and I want to do an intro into WordPress CSS. This assumes that you have a basic knowledge of what CSS is already, and I think it's one of the best skills that you can have if you run or manage a WordPress website, because there's a lot of little tweaks that you can do with CSS, whereas the average beginner is going to reach a dead end with theme customization options. And a lot of times people will end up stacking on plugin after plugin to do these little changes that you can do with CSS. And that's going to keep your website less complicated, less prone to error or conflicts. So I want to just go through some really simple basics, but hopefully teach you the fundamentals that are going to help you figure things out regardless of what theme you're using. I'm on a simple WordPress blog here using WordPress's free 2020 theme. That usually comes pre-installed if you set up your website, in the last year or so since it's been released. And we're going to go into the dashboard here. I'm logged in to the WordPress admin area. And the way that I used to do this was create a child theme and put all of my customizations within the child theme CSS file over here in the Appearance Theme Editor section. Right now you can see this is empty. And they added a new place to write your custom CSS code within the Customize section. And the big difference between these is that this style.css file, which you can see over here, that's where you can see the name of it, this can sometimes be cached using a cache plugin or an optimization plugin. And so if you make changes here, you might not see them on your live website, whereas the Appearance Customize, if we go over here, at the bottom of this page, you'll see the additional CSS option. And I actually have a couple lines of CSS code written in here. But this gets dynamically inserted into the head of your website each time it's loaded. So anytime you add changes here, you're not going to have an issue seeing them on the live website like you might if you use that style.css file. So I picked a few common areas where people are going to edit their WordPress website. And the first one is the main menu. One thing that I always like to do is break up CSS code into sections so it's easy to identify if you have to go back and make fixes later. So you can open up, or you can write a CSS comment. It's opened with this /* tag, and then you finish it with */ and anything in between that won't be interpreted, so you don't have to follow the proper syntax for CSS in between those comment codes. So I'm just going to type in main menu here to identify that all the CSS code below this is pertaining to the menu. And the way that you can do this, like I said, for any theme is just by using Google Inspector. So if you right click and hit the inspect button, it's going to bring up the code for whatever area that you clicked on. And you'll see here that if you know HTML, which again, if you're looking at CSS, I hope you have a basic knowledge of HTML, we can find that this menu is this list item here, or this list element. And right now it has the class primary menu. And if you go over to the right pane here, this is where it's going to show you all the CSS styles that are already in place. So what I'm going to do is, instead of just having the basic menu where I hover over it and I get an underline, I want to make the background turn this red color, or this dark, it's kind of like a dark pinkish color that I chose from the slider on the Customize page. And actually, if you want to see how to customize this theme without going into CSS, I have a video going through that, which I'll link up here. So the first thing you want to do is just identify either an ID. So if you have an ID like this, ID equals menu item 70, you can only have one ID on each page. So you can target an element by an ID or by a class. So in this case, it looks like all of the primary menu CSS styles are applied through this class. So I usually just copy and paste whatever element I'm trying to target. So I can copy and paste that CSS class. Because I want to change the background on a hover, I'm going to target the link within this list. So I have to jump into the LI list item and then the anchor, which is the link. And then in order to target the hover, you can use the pseudo element, which is the semicolon and then hover. And then you have the brackets, and you put all your CSS properties within these brackets. So I have all these done. I did this in advance, and let me tell you, if I was doing this in real time, it would probably be a 2 or 3 hour video because I'd be hitting a lot of snags. I went through all these, and I'm going to show you, how you can fix them. I'll go through one of my fixes, and I'm going to paste this in property by property and show you kind of my flow of hitting errors and fixing them. So I'm pasting in the CSS code that I have right here. And right now it's only 2 properties. I'm setting the background color on a hover to this dark red option, dark pink, dark red, whatever you want to call it. And I'm setting the color of the text to white. This hex code FFF is a white color. So if I hover over it, you'll see what that does. Now, we can obviously already identify a few problems. Number one, there's no padding, so we have to increase the padding. And on top of that, obviously we can't see the text because it's the same color. Now here's something with CSS. It's an important thing to know that you can have multiple CSS statements that are all targeting one element, and one of them has to take precedence. So we try to set the color here to white, but it's not happening. So usually the way to do this and fix this in a really rough way is to put this exclamation point important tag, and that kind of just overrides the precedence hierarchy. And so if we do that, you can see that that fixes it. Now that might not necessarily be the best fix, but in this case it works for us, so I'm just going to roll with it. And then to add padding, I'm just going to copy this, but without the hover pseudo selector. And I think I might have said pseudo element before. I'm probably going to make a lot of mistakes when it comes to describing some of this. The terminology I always tend to get wrong, but I mean, that's the beauty of this. It's like line by line fix, and it either works or it doesn't. You know, there's no barrier to entry. It's just a matter of you making these changes and finding what works. And I have an extra bracket there. So we have the primary menu, and we're targeting the link element without the hover. And I will paste in our padding to give it more padding. So this statement adds padding to the top and the bottom of 1 EM, which this is another thing you might want to look up that I'm not going to dig into, and that's the units that you can use for sizing on CSS. And the padding on the left and the right is 0.6. So you can see that we have more padding there. And another thing I'm going to add here just to show you, I'm going to put a border radius around this hover. So instead of being square, it should be rounded. And on top of that, now that I'm looking at it, I want to make sure that when you hover over it, we remove that underline as well. So I will paste in those properties. In order to remove the underline, you have this text decoration, and you set that to none. And then you have this border radius property, which this is a pixel unit. And this is something you just play around with until you get the right one. And one thing to note here is that it's doing this transition. So this is a newer CSS feature that instead of automatically, switching and showing you the border radius, it's transitioning from the square to the border radius over a duration of, say, maybe a half second, 1 second, whatever it's set to. And this is a perfect example of something that I don't really use that often because I always deal with the simplest design possible. Right now, I need to find how to edit this with CSS. So this is where just knowing how to Google works well. So I'm going to go to Google. Think of the CSS property that you might want to use. Search 3 to 4 word phrases around that. So in this case, we're looking for border radius, and it's transitioning. So I'm just going to search for transition. And we have one ad here. We're just going to ignore that. The first result here, this gives me the answer. You can see I've already been to this website. But if you click on here, it shows you the fix to this issue, or at least the CSS property that we're going to need to deal with. And let me find it down here. So this is it here. They have this trans class that is applying this transition CSS property, and this is where it's done. So you can see they're applying 2 transitions, a 1-second transition to the background property and a 1-second transition to the border radius property. So I'm going to copy this and just put this border radius property and set it to 0 and see if that fixes it. So I'm going to apply this again to the anchor element without the hover. So this is just across every list item element here. And I'm just going to remove the background part because we don't care about that. And I bet you I could set this to either 0s, as in 0 seconds, or 0. I would imagine that either one of these are going to work. But let's give it a shot. And looks like this did not work. So let me put that S back in there and see if that fixes it. And there you go. So I was wrong. that S actually matters. But you can see now how we have no transition on that. And another thing I want to do here, there's just a little bit too much space. You know, the padded area, that's what's showing this background color, but there's also a margin in between these list items. So I'm going to copy up one level, and this is something that like you might have to go into Chrome and see where these margins or paddings are applied. I've already done that. So I'm going to just reset the margin to 0 on the list item element. And you can see that that tightens things up. And now we have the look that we were going for. So that's one section done here. And another thing that you might want to look into a little bit further, we just touched on that, that's the margin, the padding. If you do a Google search for CSS box model, that helps to describe how all those things play into each other, the padding, the margin, the border, the width, the height, and how each of those numbers accounts for the full width of the browser or the window that the website is being displayed in. So the next section we're going to work on here, I'm just going to do one really quick line, but that's the widgets. Obviously, every WordPress theme has some kind of widgets built in. So we'll add a section here for widgets. And all the widgets on here are at the bottom. So these are widgets. I have just 2 widget areas to the left and the right. And this is that first email form here. That's where the custom CSS in this first section that was already here is being applied to. And then you have the archives on the right. So I'm going to right click. Like I said, this is the way I start everything. Go into Google Chrome and try and pick the unique identifiers, whether it's the actual HTML ID or the classes, in order to target the areas that I want to customize. So for this, the only change I'm going to make here is on the padding above this widget area. So if I hover over enough, you're going to see this class footer widgets outer wrapper, and how it has a pretty big padding to the top and the bottom set here. And if we drop down to a mobile width, which you can do within this appearance customize section, you can see how this padding is reduced on the mobile screen. Now I just, on the right hand pane here, like I said, I want to see where this padding is being applied, and it's right here. You can see this is using the units REM versus EM. Again, I'm not going to dig too much into that. So you can see it's also highlighting the specific target here. This footer top is not being targeted, and that's why it's grayed out a little bit. I don't know if you could see that clearly here. But it's pretty much telling us that the CSS area that we want is this footer widgets outer wrapper. And since I'm going to change the padding, I'm just going to copy this entire piece of code, and I'm just going to have to remove this site footer. You can apply a CSS property to multiple elements just by separating them with a comma, and that's what's done here. So let me paste that in, and like I said, I'll remove this last target after the comma. And the same thing with this first one here, the footer top, and I'm just going to leave this class footer widgets outer wrapper. And you can see on the mobile menu here it's set to 3. Like I said, when it was wider here, it was set to 8. I don't think I showed you that before, but all I'm going to do here is just set it to 4, and it's going to be 4 on both the mobile and the desktop version. Let me just show you when I change that from 3 to 4. If you take a look over here, you'll see how a little bit extra padding gets added. And the same thing if I drop it out there. Instead of being 8, which you can see over here, we override that with our custom setting. And here's just another offshoot if you want to look into this. You can see that the way that you build responsiveness into it is by using this @media CSS. See, I don't even know what this is. It's a statement. But you can target either minimum width, maximum width. So this is basically saying that if the minimum width of the window is 700 pixels, anything above 700 pixels, apply this padding. And our custom style within this additional CSS section is taking precedence over that. You know, one thing you might want to do is leave this statement in there, and you can wrap a comment around a CSS statement. So if you do that, it's going to remove it, and we get back that 8 REM padding. And that's just a good way to test something by removing it through comments instead of actually removing it if you just want to keep it in there, just so you have it on hand. So let me remove the comments, and you'll see how that drops back down. The thing you want to note with widgets is that widgets can be added across several areas of your website depending on the theme. Just like with everything else I mentioned here, you want to look for either a unique identifier for one specific widget if you just want to apply a style to that widget, or if you want to apply a style generally across every widget, look for the general class that every widget has in common. Next up, let's do something in a blog post. So I'll go back to the top and go into an individual blog post. And I just have one here. This is just a test post that has a few content elements in here, headings, list item, quote. So what I'm going to do here is change the style for the quote. Now this one, just to save a little bit of time, I'm not going to go through this one property by property. Let me paste it in, and this is what I have here. And right away I can see I have a little bit of an issue here with this being shifted to the left. But I just changed the block quote style to have an open quote and an end quote. I moved the citation over to the right. So let me just hit Control Z and you can see the difference here. So they have a little red bar on the left. Everything is aligned to the left here, but this block quote is centered. I'm going to have to see why that happens. So let me paste mine back in and you'll see the changes. So let me actually right click on this and take a look. See if we can figure out what's happening here. And if I go to the right, you have to become an investigator to kind of figure out what's going on. And a lot of times this is going to frustrate you. Until you do this maybe 10, 20, 30 times, you're not going to know what you're looking for. It usually takes about an hour or 2 hours to find something really simple the first time. And then after that, every single subsequent time, it's going to take you 5 minutes. But there's probably 100 or 200 different fixes that you're going to have to go through over the course of, a year or two of building your website to figure it out. It looks like it has something to do with the margin here. Now I have 0.5 set to the left and the right margin. I'm not sure if I can do this if I set it to auto. Yeah, it looks like that works. Usually if you set the left or right margin to auto, that'll center it. And that seems to have fixed it for us. So let me drop down to mobile, and then once I verify this is working, yeah, that looks good. So I'll just quickly explain some of these styles that I applied to this. So the first thing I had to do, because we had that left border, that red border on the left, I had to set the border to none. And if I hover over this, you can see that the orange area is the margin, and then the green area is where I have the padding. So up here you can see the padding on the right and the left is set to 2.5 EM, and that's to account for those opening and closing quotes. And those are added through this before. Again, I can't remember what this is called. Let's do a Google and let's see what happens. So I actually have this open here. Even I looked this up right before I started recording and I already forgot it. So yeah, it's a selector, the CSS before selector. And anytime I'm looking for CSS, I just search Google and I'm always looking for this site, W3 Schools. I feel like they're always the most concise and they give you all the options for the properties along with a few examples that you can try yourself. So basically this before element just adds in some type of content before or after that isn't actual content. You know what I mean? Like it's more for the design than it is the content. And up here you can see that we set the before and after to this code, this /201C. And once again, I forget what this is. I think it might be an ASCII code. We do a little magic with the positioning. We have absolute positioning. That open quote we set to the top left. The after quote we set to the bottom right. And we do a little bit of adjustments with the margins to make sure that it's aligned properly. And the other thing we have here is just this site element. So all we do is just align that to the right with this text align property. So that's a quick explanation of this. And the one thing I forgot to mention is that I'm targeting not just the block quote, which is the HTML element for quotes, but I'm targeting block quotes within the entry content class. And that's the class that WordPress by default always throws into the element that shows your post. So if we go into here, you can see this div class entry content. You're going to see that on every WordPress website, on every theme. So it's usually a good way to target any content within a post. The last line of code that we're going to add is for the footer. So we're going to scroll all the way down, and I'll just highlight the footer to get inside of the footer code. And I mean, this is pretty easy. You can see when you hover over here, this you have the HTML element footer along with ID site footer. And I'm just going to reduce the font size, make this a little bit smaller. So on the right hand side, I'm just looking for the font size, declaration, and we have it right here. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. And we'll add another comment with footer and paste in our code. And I'm just going to drop this down to, let's say, 1.4 EM instead of 1.6. And so that makes our code smaller. Now, if you actually want to edit the content within the footer, you're going to have to go into the template files or see if your theme has a way to edit it within the customizer. But that's pretty much all I wanted to go through today. I'm not, trying to give you a massive project. Just touch on a lot of things that are going to help you edit your own website, because obviously every WordPress website looks different. I want to discuss one more topic, and that's the body element. So if I scroll up to the top here, let me see if I could just jump in here closer to the top. Oh, here we go. So I have the body element here, and you want to look at the body classes because there's a lot of ways that you can target based on these classes. So a lot of times, like for instance right now, you can see that this is using the post template, template cover. There's a lot of different classes that you can target here. And usually this is the way that Visual Builder themes on WordPress work. They have specific templates and they'll insert class code for the template. So instead of targeting specific pages, you can target an entire template that applies to multiple pages. But also on here you can see the post ID. So you can see post ID-49. That's if you want to target one specific post. You'll see the same thing on the pages. If I go to the About page, you'll see a page ID. And let me go back up to the body element right there. Whoa, I don't think that's it. There you go. Now I got to realize that this is actually showing HTML code within an iframe within this WordPress admin window. So I was going up too high a level here, scrolling to the top. But this is the body for the WordPress page. So here you can see page ID 8. So if you wanted to write code specific to the About page, this is probably what you would want to use. Another cool one is this logged in. So if you have maybe a menu or a section that you only want to show to people that have a WordPress account on your website and are logged in, you can add this class. So I highly recommend that you look into your body tags on each page to see ways that you can target, again, specific to your theme and your setup. And then if you want to dig more into the hierarchy, I always used to call it CSS hierarchy, but as I did the search for that, I see that it's called CSS Specificity. And W3 Schools has a nice little breakdown here. They kind of show you that the 4 categories are the inline styles. So that's kind of what this entire additional CSS section does. It adds these styles inline within the head of the document. And then you have IDs, which an ID is unique to the page, so you should only have one ID per page. Classes can be applied to multiple elements. And then you have your plain HTML elements. So if you just want to target a div or anchor element without any classes or IDs, those have the lowest level of precedence. And then if you have multiple lines of CSS code that are targeting the same element, usually the last line is going to be the one that overwrites every prior line. So these are the fundamentals of CSS, and that's kind of how you apply them to the WordPress template and theme system. That's all I got for this video, and I really hope you found it helpful. I like to apply CSS customizations to every site I do. I never overdo it. I try and limit it to maybe 25 or 50 lines of code max. I'm not looking to write 1,000 lines of code and do a crazy custom theme design, but I do like to add little custom changes to make sure that each site that I do is unique. But at the same time, there's also elements that I copy and paste exactly from site to site. And really, you can do a lot with the appearance customized section without even digging into CSS. But this gives you so much more control that I think it's a great skill to have. I created my first WordPress blog back in around 2010, and that's where I first applied CSS. I pretty much created a custom layout. I spent a ton of time learning CSS back, in those days. I also installed a forum, and through CSS was able to match the forum design to the blog design instead of using the generic forum design through whatever plugin I installed back then. And then I ended up parlaying those skills into a freelancing business where I started working for local businesses, creating their website and managing their online presence. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in, go to my homepage, websiteprofitcourse.com, and you can download a free giveaway, 15 tools to start your web design business. These include many of the ones that I use day in and day out, along with a bunch of free options that will help your process and your workflow. And if you're just getting into WordPress, maybe not in the freelancing stage, but you're just wanting to learn more about how WordPress is put together and how to use it either as a blog or a business website, I have a free training that goes more in depth on the WordPress admin area. You can get a full tour of that along with how to set up your WordPress website and customize it. Check that out at websiteprofitcourse.com/WP101. I'll include a link to this free WordPress training up here in the top right, and I'll include both of these links down in the description below. Last but not least, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more WordPress and freelancing videos. I think the best thing you can do to learn WordPress is set up and manage multiple websites. If you have any questions on CSS, leave them in the comments below. Obviously, code questions are kind of tough to answer, but if it's just a generic question regarding a CSS property or something like that, I may be able to point you in the right direction. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope you have a great day.